In yet another sign China is open for business, Beijing hosts its first international economic and trade event since the coronavirus pandemic. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Six months after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic, China's economy is showing signs of recovery. Exports rose more than 9% in August compared with last year, and despite tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, exports to the United States increased by 27%. China also saw trade growth with the European Union, Japan, and some Southeast Asian nations. This week, Beijing welcomed more than 2,000 domestic and foreign companies to showcase their latest projects and services at the 2020 China International Fair for Trade and Services. During the conference, President Xi Jinping pledged China would continue to open up its market and promote global trade. Well, for more now on China's economic recovery, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He's a political and economic affairs commentator. From New York, Thomas Hayes is the chairman and managing member of Great Hill Capital. And Jeff Moon is an international trade and government affairs consultant right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Einar Tangen, let me start with you and let's look at some of those numbers. Chinese exports rose 9.5% in August, but imports were sluggish, falling by 2.1%. Given those numbers, what are your expectations for the Chinese economy by the end of this year?
Well, China continues a very strong V recovery. Long term, we've talked about the fact that a lot will depend on global demand. But as the only functioning economy right now, and as countries start to try to emerge from the latest wave of COVID-19, China is really standing to gain. This will continue until there is a real vaccine that can kind of guarantee that economies can go forward without shutdowns.
So, Anna, do you see those exports grow as we get towards the end of the year? That would mean that there's going to be demand in other parts of the world as well.
Well, yeah, quite frankly, it's just there's no other choice. Global demand is, in fact, suppressed. There will be a bump up as economies start to open up. But remember, there could very well be a second shutdown. But even in that kind of a situation, there are things that countries need. Absolutely essentials, whether it's from PPE to home exercise equipment, etc. And these will continue to be strong points for the Chinese economy because it is operating. Now, that assumes that China is able to avoid the worst of the second wave, which is expected come October, November.
Thomas Hayes, let's look at the other side of the news that we're talking about, and that's the fact that imports dropped by 2.1%. Does that indicate that there's weak consumption? And if that is so, what does that mean for the Chinese economic recovery?
Yeah, well, I think the consumption is a lagging indicator. The key is that you're seeing a huge growth in construction and in infrastructure, and that's largely led by the government stimulus. You had $500 billion in May. You have about 3.6% deficit spending, and you're seeing all kinds of projects that are going into rail, into power lines, into electric vehicle charging stations, and this is driving growth. As a matter of fact, Fitch took up their GDP estimates for China for 2020 to 2.7% positive GDP growth. So while the consumer is lagging behind as they're still faced with social distancing and different factors, they will catch up. That is a lagging indicator. And I think the most important thing about the fair that you brought up, Anand, was that those thousands of people were in person. This was, yes, it was a hybrid online fair for foreigners, but on a domestic basis, people attended in person. So this was a kind of symbolic return to normalcy, and we're certainly seeing it in the economic data here.
Jeff Moon, the United States was reportedly the biggest buyer of Chinese exports for the fifth consecutive month in August. Yet if we listen to President Trump, he continues to talk about decoupling the economies of these two countries, the world's biggest and second biggest economy. Let's listen to what the president had to say.
So when you mention the word decouple, it's an interesting word. So we lose billions of dollars, and if we didn't do business with them, we wouldn't lose billions of dollars. It's called decoupling, so you'll start thinking about it.
So does that really make sense, Jeff? Given the level of trade between these two countries, I mean, what is the president talking about here, or is this just election rhetoric?
This is just election rhetoric, I think, and more of his rhetoric about trade as well. It is impossible for the U.S. and China to decouple. As much as some in the White House would like for that to happen, there is an enormous amount of interdependency both ways. And so the trade fair, for example, in services highlights the interdependency on services as well, which I think is very positive. What we need to do is get over all the political disputes, get back to the table to discuss our economic differences, because we are so interdependent that we need to solve them.
And do you think any of that could happen, getting back to the table, Jeff, before November 3rd?
I don't think so. I think the rhetoric is just too hot right now, and Trump is in a defensive position. He's behind in the polls. He's looking for ways to try to boost his base, and it's become clear that even according to his own people, that China is an issue that he thinks could be favorable for him. So I don't see much movement before that. I do think there could be movement afterward.
Anna Tangen, what kind of a response has there been in China to this talk of decoupling the economies?
Well, I mean, it's been going on for quite some time. There's this idea of a dual circulation, which is being pushed, which in essence says that China is going to be an internal demand economy, which is supported by international trade and services. But it's quite clear that Beijing is battening down the hatches for what could be a rocky 3 to 5 years as the world tries to recover from COVID-19. And, there's going to be a lot of social unrest. People are going to try to look for someone to blame. And China doesn't want to be in the target zone for that. They just want to kind of get on with things, try to avoid the middle income trap, try to plan their economy as best they can. And that's really, the issues here is just try to avoid the pitfalls that are being created, not by China itself, but simply by the reaction to a pandemic by the global community.
All right, let's bring in Yan Liang from Portland, Oregon. She joins us from there. She's an associate professor of economics at Willamette University. Yan Liang, great to see you. Thanks for being with us. We're talking about the Chinese economy and these figures that have just come out. We looked at Chinese exports, talking about it earlier. It rose 9.5% in August, but imports were sluggish, falling 2.1%, as I mentioned. What are your thoughts on where the Chinese economy is going?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so sorry for the delay, the wildfires. That's a story for another day. But yes, the numbers, I think, it's not too surprising that China's exports has registered strong growth. I think from the supply side, China is one of the few countries that really rolled out of the pandemic and resumed sort of normal production, especially manufacturing production. And then so the supply is ratcheting up. And then on the demand side, the rest of the world is still in great need of PPEs. And when you look at, for example, the Chinese exports to the U.S., what we found at the tops are computers, cell phones, TV sets, children's toys and bicycles and things like that. So, when people hunker down and learn and work remotely, they need a lot of these equipments. So I think, both supply side and demand side come together to drive that export growth. The import side, I think it's a little bit concerning because this on top of the fact that, the first 7 months, the Chinese retail sales has shrunk by 10%. And then we're also looking at pretty, bad situation on employment. So I think what that shows is China's domestic demand still needs to have a way to go to recover, and that requires more maybe government policies and et cetera, which we can come back later.
Right, bicycle imports. Don't we know many stores here in Washington, I know, have run out of bicycles. Thomas Hayes, President Trump is also threatening to impose tariffs on companies that create jobs in China or in other countries. But the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, they've done a survey. They surveyed 200 companies, and they found that only 4% of those companies say they would move their manufacturing back to the United States or move it to the United States. What do you make of that survey?
Yeah, I think that President Trump in the campaign rhetoric has talked about manufacturing independence. And this is no different than energy independence. Just because we became energy independent from the Middle East doesn't mean we stopped doing business with them. As a matter of fact, we still import quite a bit of oil. And I think his point is that he doesn't want to rely on other countries for manufacturing, but that does not mean that he doesn't want to do business with them. He just wants to do it on a fair and reciprocal basis. And I think as far as U.S.-China relations go, it's going to come down to the implementation of the Phase 1 deal. There was some worry earlier in the year that the Chinese purchases were falling behind. But with the advent of the floods and the demand for agriculture, as a matter of fact, yesterday, the soybean purchases of 664,000 tons were the highest since July. And I think that's going to continue. The demand for pork is going to continue because you had the culling of 1 million of the herd from the swine flu last year. So the numbers are picking up, and it looks like the Chinese are now in line with estimates for the purchases in 2020 on the agricultural side. That needs to pick up on the energy side. But that was a hard-fought win for both sides, and I don't see that unraveling unless certain conditions are not met by either side. And right now, it looks like that they're both moving in the direction of meeting those conditions, and that's a very constructive thing going forward, despite the rhetoric that you discussed.
Right. You know, Jeff Moon, we were talking a moment ago about that rhetoric, about what's coming out of the White House, the president talking about decoupling and imposing tariffs. But has there already been some kind of damage? I mean, we know that some manufacturing capacity has already moved out of China to other countries. Some of the manufacturing has moved to Mexico, for instance. Could that result in higher prices and I guess, less competitiveness for U.S. companies?
Well, I think there are two kinds of companies in China, broadly speaking. There are companies that are there mainly to manufacture for the China market and perhaps other markets as well. Then there have been companies that are there to market or to manufacture for other markets outside of China. The survey that you cited from Shanghai is interesting. Yeah. And I'd like to know how many companies were in each of those categories, because the people that are there in China to manufacture for the Chinese market are not going anywhere. The people that were manufacturing for other markets and found cheaper places to do the manufacturing and in relatively simple manufacturing processes, they've already gone. There are other companies that are there that have very complicated manufacturing processes that can't be moved very well. So it's not a uniform picture in terms of all the companies, and predicting pricing and competitiveness also really varies from product to product and company to company.
Right. Yan Liang, there was an interesting piece in the Australian newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald, which said, among other things, and I'm quoting here, if Trump's strategic rivalry overwhelms the economic rationale for the relationship, the damage to America's largest corporations will be severe. In fact, the writer of that article, Stephen Bartholomew's, says he believes that some of the damage has already been done, whether Trump is reelected or not. What do you think?
Yes, I think, that speaks really well to the reality where, all these decoupling rhetoric and the imposition of tariffs or calling companies back home, I think eventually really hurt the U.S. businesses. And, the survey that you talk about, AmCham, 58% of the respondents said that they worried about the U.S.-China relationships. And yes, they're not leaving because they adopt this in China, for China strategy. And yes, still 22% of them said they are, planning to delay some investments. And so I think this definitely hurts the company's bottom line. And then also when you think about, financial giants, right, they are in search of growth. They're looking for China's markets. We have JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Vanguard, American Express. They're all coming to China and hopefully can, enjoy the growth of markets in the service sector. So I think, this irresponsible, tariffs are just trying to really mess with the business operations, not to mention the onerous costs that are imposed on the U.S. consumers, especially, low-income Americans who I think these days have very, high income elasticity of demand for Chinese exports and also price sensitivity of products. That's why they cut down a lot of the spendings at home. Restaurant dining probably not an option, so they buy a lot of Chinese products and so on. The bicycle story. I think you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. We're seeing the shortage. So I think again, these political rhetoric or political game, it's not really in the interest of the people, of the businesses.
Anna Tanga, let's talk about that trade fair in China. Beijing just wrapped up that first international economic trade event. It hosted about 141 international organizations and companies. President Xi Jinping said China is opening up. Let's listen to what he had to say.
China will increase its openness, set up a robust cross-border services trade negative list system, promote a pilot and open platform for innovative development of trade and services, continue to ease market access for the service sector, and take the initiative to expand the import of high-quality services.
So, Anna, listening there to the Chinese president, what's the plan to accomplish these goals?
Well, the negative lists are being reduced. One notable exception, obviously TikTok has crawled into this, not debate, this kind of conflict that's going on between these nations. China will not allow forced technology transfer. It's funny to be saying that China is the one who's trying to prevent that, because it has always been on the other side. In terms of imports, especially of trade services, China is very anxious to make sure that its economy is working as efficiently as possible. And that's what we're really talking about here. When you can't, the market works on price, all right, and value. And right now, you can say what you want about all of these different factors, where you're producing for and from. But in the end, if you're the most efficient producer, which is in terms of your production costs and your sales price, you're going to be the winner. And this idea that somehow you can separate the economies, I would agree with your question, is can the U.S. remain competitive with this kind of strategy? So at this point, China is moving forward with its desire to be more self-reliant, just because of these kind of frictions that are happening on the geopolitical stage. But keep in mind, at the end of the day, when you start putting in the idea of the amounts that are involved in U.S. companies in China, that's $500 billion a year. So when you add that up, China is about $10 billion a year in terms of sales of Chinese companies based in the U.S. In essence, the U.S. has a surplus with China of $150 billion. If that is erased, you can expect to see very dire consequences across the U.S. For the economy.
And something else that you mentioned earlier on, and that was the time horizon that you gave us. You said, China's battening down the hatches for the next 3 to 5 years, as the rest of the world tries to recover as well. So is that what China's looking at? It won't be sort of 3 to 5 years before we see any resemblance of what we could call normalcy?
Well, that's my own personal point of view. I don't know what kind of time horizon. I know that there's a 5-year plan that's coming up in October, and it's quite clear that the dual circulation economy, this idea of putting domestic ahead of international trade as in terms of reliance, is going to be one of the main factors that they're discussing. So I'm assuming that they think that this is going to be a fairly long-term situation in terms of the next 5 years. Not long term, but at least intermediate term, 5 years. Then you don't know what the situation is. You don't know when the vaccines are going to be created, when the rest of the world starts to pick up so that there is demand. And that's why you can't, China is not choosing to rely on the international trade component because of the unknowns.
Yan Liang, what are your thoughts on the opening up of China's services sector? We're seeing that in Beijing. Could that serve as an example for the rest of the country?
So I think I have 2 points on this question. On the one hand, I think, yes, service sector is growing rapidly in China. Right now, it's accounting for 30-some% of GDP and accounting for 60% of the growth. So I think opening up for service, on the one hand, is really to boost the competitiveness, because there is a productivity gap in the service sector that China can amend by learning from abroad, by importing the services. And then I also think that this is a great venue for China to be able to contribute to the global economy by importing more, not commodities, products, but services. That I want to just make a quick note here, which is, the U.S. has been turning against China, for example, for students, right? They have banned recently 1,000 students' visas. And the students that are coming here for the education, 600,000 of them, they're contributing significantly, right, to the U.S.'s exports of services to China. So I think, this whole decoupling is really the U.S. is shooting on its own feet. Then going back to what I think your previous speaker was talking about, I think the dual circulation, it's not just a temporary sort of strategy to sort of counterbalance or countervail the U.S.'s strategy or the pandemic. I think from very early on, back in 2013, China has adopted the strategy to rely more on domestic consumption growth instead of international, markets, and also trying to develop its own technology instead of depend on foreign technology. So I think this is in a way a continuity of its strategic sort of shift to build more domestic demand and domestic technological reliance.
Jeff Moon, a criticism that we've heard very often here in the United States, and we've talked about this before, is that China doesn't really offer a level playing field for companies wishing to do business there. Is that changing?
Well, specifically in the services area, this is actually very interesting because from the American perspective, services is the silver lining in a dark and cloudy trade picture. In 2018, for example, the overall trade deficit in goods and services was something like $380 billion. But within that number, the U.S. ran a trade surplus in services of $40 billion. So American services have been welcomed in the China market, but more needs to be done. It's good that there is a trade fair and that China's leadership is saying they want to open up the market. I would say, rather than talk about it, just do it. Just allow digital services to come through the Great Firewall, allow cloud computing by Americans in China, allow legal services, express delivery, theatrical films. I could go on and on. This is well documented. So there is a positive story with regard to services. China is saying that it wants to consume more services. And one positive story that could come out of the trade war and be of benefit to both sides would be more true opening of services.
Thomas Hayes, we talk about what.
How does that?
Go ahead, Anna.
How does that happen when the U.S. is imposing all of these sanctions on everyone from officials to students, tariffs, unilateral moves, attacks against international things? I mean, you can't say that it's China should open the door while others are closing the door in China's face. It has to be a reciprocal policy. So, there's got to be some balance here. You can't just say it's a one-way situation where China's at fault.
Well, actually, all of the things that I talked about,
the core thing of the relationship is fair and reciprocal. For instance, with the New York Stock Exchange listings, the administration said, if you want to list on the New York Stock Exchange, you now have to abide by the same auditing policies that U.S. companies and other foreign companies have to abide by to get listed and to access our capital markets. So yes, it is fair and reciprocal, and it has to go both ways. Yeah. To your previous speaker, who had a less sanguine outlook on the China recovery, I would say looking at the seats in the air last month for domestic air travel without a vaccine in China is already at 86% of pre-pandemic levels and is expected to hit 100% in the month of September. And that's even before a vaccine. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to see a return to normalcy much sooner than anticipated. And you're seeing that in the export data, in the global pent-up demand, and in the positive GDP revisions, not only for the U.S., but for China and for other parts of the world as well. So, and finally, as far as the domestic production of technology that one of your other panelists spoke to, the Made in China plan calls for 40% of domestically used semiconductors in China to be produced in China by the end of this year, and 70% of semiconductors to be produced in China by 2025. So while President Trump talks about 10 million manufacturing jobs coming back from China, the Chinese government also talks about creating 9 million jobs by the end of this year domestically so that they can keep the unemployment rate at 6%. So I think both sides have the goals of not having to rely on one another, but at the same time still doing tremendous amounts of business together in a win-win relationship.
All right, Jeff Moon, you wanted to say something on this question of reciprocity and fairness.
Yeah, I was just going to make a very quick parallel point, actually. Each of the examples that I listed are sectors where China is allowed to do business in the United States, but the U.S. is not allowed to do business in China. So China could just sign laws and lift regulations and allow access. And that's what the trade dispute is all about the unfairness of the trading relationship and China's need to rethink and open up in order to get access.
You know, Yan Liang.
Well, this idea that somehow that the U.S. has been victimized by China is ridiculous. I mean, you cannot go up to somebody, punch them in the face, and then be surprised when they react. I mean, you can't have a situation where China is saying, you know, on one hand, yes, we're going to impose the same restrictions on stock people who are listing their stock companies in the U.S. That's fine. But when the president comes out and says we're going to force these companies out of the United States, that's not. So this you can't talk out of both sides of their mouth. It has to be one or the other. There's reciprocal trade on all fronts, or there's not going to be a very good relationship.
All right, Yan Liang, I've just got a little bit more than a minute left, and I'm going to talk about possibly another setback, and that is the United States is threatening to block imports of tomatoes and cotton from China because the United States claims that they come from Xinjiang, and the U.S. claims that it's produced by forced labor. China has dismissed that allegation, but how serious is this? Could it be another big setback?
I don't think so. I think, this is, again, just the, President Trump's MO, right? That as we get closer and closer to election days, then there are a lot more pressure on China, from trade to human rights, you name it. But I don't think this is going to be sort of the last straw on the camel's back. But I want to really go back to the 2 points that have been raised, which I think is really interesting. One is on, what China should do. I think China should just do what is good for it, right? What is good for its growth and its future and its sustainable development. So I think continue to open, for example, in the service sector, that would help to boost competitiveness. I think that China should go ahead and do it. And then, when it comes to level playing field, I think this is just a way to say China is not allowed to adopt industrial policies that is to its own benefits. And I don't think that's what China should do, to abandon any sort of industrial policy under the pressure of the U.S. And then for the economy, I think the darkest spot to me is employment. We're talking about 8 million college graduates, and 5.9 million of them are still looking for jobs. So I think what the government really needs to do is to try to create more jobs instead of just trying to stimulate this infrastructure spending.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Great discussion. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.